are listening to 10,000 Swamp Leaders, leadership conversations that explore adapting and thriving in a complex world with Rick Torsett and guests.
Hi, everybody. This is Rick Torsett, and this is 10,000 Swamp Leaders. This is the podcast where we have conversations with individuals who've made a decision in their life and in their career to use themselves to lead on some very difficult challenges. How they use themselves is multifaceted, as you know, if you've listened to podcasts. Some are very much frontline, some are in support roles, some are in teaching roles, some are in consulting roles. Today, my guest is Nick Ellem, and Nick is from New South Wales, Australia, Sydney, I believe. Nick, you can clean me up in a second on that one. And Nick kind of wears all those hats, near as I can tell. He's a teacher, he's a coach, he is a contributor, and he is an originator of ideas. And it's all of those things together that intrigued me, that caused me to try and badger him into coming to the swamp and having a conversation. He said yes. So Nick Ellem, welcome to the swamp. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Rick. It's nice to be here.
Yeah. So in order to get us started, I'm going to give you space to tell people what it is you want them to know about you, and then we'll just get into the work that you're up to.
Well, first and foremost, I'm an adaptive leadership practitioner. I think as many people who listen to this podcast and some people that you've had on the podcast have had an out-of-body experience from attending the Harvard program with Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky. And I attended that program in 2012. And I think that was a really life-changing experience for me, being in a room at the age of 32 with 60 other leaders from across the world who are looking to develop leadership. And I think for me, it was a real eye-opening kind of experience. And so I think that's what brings me to, I started my career in adult education, mainly involved in training roles and organizational development roles. And I came across adaptive leadership in 2011, where I met a woman named Rosamond Christie, and Rosamond had been engaged by our organization to run a leadership program. And I noticed on her bio was this art and practice of leadership program, and it really intrigued me. And so that was really where my journey started with leadership development. So I've been in leadership development for the last 13 or 14 years. And after coming back from the Harvard program, had a really an eagerness to start playing with the model and the ideas and to start learning and experimenting. And I think that's really, where I've been, in the last 10 years since I've been at the Kennedy School, and really just getting my hands dirty. I've worked in non-for-profit and government agencies in internal leadership development roles. And I've also done a bit of consulting and coaching, really working in large complex systems that are quite fractured, complex, have really taken on large, messy problems, and using the adaptive leadership framework to really help frame what those challenges are, but then how do we actually intervene skillfully? So that's really what I've been playing with and experimenting with over the last 10 years or so.
Great. So as you mentioned, there's been prior guests on the podcast who have a adaptive leadership background and come from all sorts of places around the world. I'm one of those people. But for listeners who may not have listened to any of those prior episodes and they're hearing you talk about this for the first time, because this will be a bit of a songline, I think, that carries our conversation here, at least in the background. Help people understand what is adaptive leadership? Why does it matter? Why do we need it in the world? And why have you decided to make it a fundamental part of how you spend your time and having impact?
Yeah, there's a lot of questions there, but I think for me, what is adaptive leadership? It really is about helping people find their own capacity. In the sense, when Ron wrote that first book in 1994, Leadership Without Easy Answers, I think that really kind of laid the foundations for building on the work of many other people, but really illustrating that leadership can be exercised from any position, anywhere, at any time. And I think that really is what adaptive leadership is all about. What adaptation do we need to make in this situation, in around this particular set of issues, as an individual, as an organization, as a team, as a community, as a country? And I think that's the opportunity that it brings to the fore, that it provides more, as Ronnie would say, more diagnostic options and more action options to play with. It gives people more options than they would necessarily have. And I think what it also provides is that opportunity to see themselves as a leader where they may have not seen themselves as a leader, that leadership comes from above. And I think that's where adaptive leadership provides a rich opportunity to be creative, to experiment, to try things differently and take risks on behalf of something they really care about. And I think what happens often is you and I are always wanting to make a contribution to the world, to make a better contribution than we have in the past. And I think we know that people find it difficult to navigate situations. And I think this framework provides a clarity, provides a way of seeing problems that we can't unsee. And I think that's the power of the adaptive leadership framework. And it's an extraordinary framework in the sense that it makes that distinction between the balcony and the dance floor. And I think often the leaders that I work with every day are very much on the dance floor, and they are rewarded to be there. And I think what leaders find the biggest thing is being able to, which is most critical, is to be able to step out of their day-to-day and really understand the pattern that they are caught in. And particularly when they're in situations which they can't see the forest for the trees, I think that's really where the framework is so useful, powerful, and has currency. And I think it's the other part of it is it has its own language, and it gives people a language to be able to, a common language, particularly if you're, the books that have been developed, whether it's Ron's books and Marty's books together, or other people that have extended the work of adaptive leadership, because it's been now 40 years. Who would have thought? It's been around for such a significant period of time. And we're coming up to a celebratory year. In October, the Kennedy School and the Adaptive Leadership Network are holding a 40-year event. And so I think it's an opportunity, as well as for people that are new to these set of ideas, to learn, but also to bring new ideas to the model, because I think it's something that the model's not a set and forget sort of set of ideas, because I think we're all coming up against challenges that are equally complex, if not more complex than they have been. And I think that's the beautiful community that it has created over the last 40 years, that people it's generated so much sense of purpose around trying to overcome some of these big adaptive challenges, whether it's climate change, whether it's how we address technological innovation, how do we create better, more vital communities. I think the organisations that I've worked in are very aligned to those sets of values. And I think for me, the adaptive leadership framework is a mechanism, a vehicle by which we can really make progress on those big, daunting challenges.
Thank you. You started this conversation, or this answering my question, with a point that I don't want to bury this lead, which is that leadership can come from anywhere in the system. Anybody in any chair can lead. But let's talk a little bit about that, because I think that gets passed over and glossed over. The significance of making the choice to raise your hand and lead in a system or in a culture that has not necessarily nurtured that as a deal. So meaning it's a risky proposition for a lot of people, both either in the world they work in or the way in which they're constituted. So talk a little bit about what's that really about? And let's just give people counsel right from the get-go here. What have you learned about that moment in time when you choose to raise your hand and make a choice? How do people prepare for that? And what do you think they ought to know about it in advance, so that when they do come to that point, they have some understanding?
Yeah, it's a big question, Rick. I think what's important to be thinking about is, when you're trying to exercise leadership, is the impact you're going to make on people, whether good, bad, or indifferent. And so the level of risk that you're taking has to be measured with the people that you're trying to move. And I think if leadership is about holding attention and keeping attention on the issues, I think it's about understanding the community that you're trying to mobilize. And I think that's we think that it's a really important issue to us, but we've got to understand where are people sitting on this issue. And I think that that diagnostic work about trying to understand what are the people's values, what are people's loyalties, which group are they, which particular camp are they sitting in on that issue, I think it's really important. And to really to walk in their shoes, to, as Maxime Fern would say, is being able to operate from the enemy's camp, to be able to see what is going on from their perspective. And I think that's a real capacity that we're not seeing a lot of today, where people can sit with other people and who are completely in opposition to what's going to in terms of ideas, and to be able to still walk away and to be respectful of each other. And I think that's the real challenge. Is the adaptive leadership framework provides a set of practices and a way of having dialogue in a way that tries to, in service of the whole, not just in service of one particular group. And I think that's the most important thing, is being able to start where people are and to be able to think about what's important to not only to a particular faction or particular group or individual or set of values, but what's important to the whole. And I think it's being able to think systemically. And I think that's where leaders struggle with, is because leaders think what's in front of them. And so how to think more systemically about what is actually in service of the group or the community. I think people kind of can lip service to those ideas, but I think actually what it actually means for them is to actually have to give something up, whether that's status, credibility, significance of, their own significance, where it's not about them, it's actually about the issue. And I think that's the power of the framework. It's actually kind of giving us space to be able to hold multiple perspectives.
Okay. You mentioned a word here that comes up frequently with people who are familiar with the framework and the structure of adaptive leadership. And that was the word mobilize. For people who are unfamiliar, this word will come up frequently. And so let's give it some specific context and meaning, and why in the world somebody has to mobilize, because in most organizations, the leaders just tell people what to do. And so there's a couple things to unpack there that I'll leave it to you to unpack, but mobilizing is a critical element of the work. So what's it mean? I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, I think for me, mobilizing is bringing people together on difficult issues. And that's partnership. Leadership is not a lone wolf activity. It's done with other people. And so that, in essence, it's not like the traditional kind of notion that around, I just tell you what to do and you do it. It's not. It's actually when it's adaptive, the challenge, it requires learning. It requires partnering. It requires learning through others. It requires building alliances and understanding that we need to build relationships to solve this complex challenge. Because what we're going to have to do is really understand, be able to shift those, because those relationships may not be working for the issue. And so what do we need to do to be able to, if we've got to mobilize this complex set of relationships to make progress on this issue, but also build the capacity of people to understand what we need to do together to make this new future possible. Because our assumption is we need to change for whatever reason. But also it's about confronting a reality that we're not willing to face into. And we need others to help us face into that, because we need a new faction, a new set of alliances that we need to build to confront an issue. And those current alliances may not actually be serving the issue. And I know Jeff Lawrence says this often, who's another adaptive practitioner out there, and is often referred to in Marty and Ronnie's work, is there's no such thing as a dysfunctional community or broken organization. It's set up to receive the results it's currently getting. And so that starting from that place is really important, I think, to when we think about mobilization, is what of those relationships, what of those alliances, what do they need to learn? What do they need to depart from? So what traditions are essential and serving us well, but what new capacities do we need to let go of, and what new capacities do we need to learn? So they're the kind of essential questions any leader has to kind of think about when they're trying to orchestrate or mobilize people on an issue. Is, well, what do we need to do differently, and how do we do that together? And I think it's that whole notion of kind of, if you've got to move as fast as everyone else around you. And I think that's where leaders fall short often, or get tripped up, is because they're moving too quickly. They're just focusing on their own agenda. And I think that's the work of leadership, is being able to hold and bring people's attention together and mobilize people to get things done, both technical and adaptive. And I think that's often missed, is that people go, well, we're just trying to do adaptive work. We're trying to do it all. And I think we're trying to do both the technical work in concert with the adaptive work that needs to be done. I don't think you can't do it without the other. So I think that's a really important, essential task, is to be able to think about mobilization in the form of both at an individual level, at a relational level, and across the system. Because I think, and as Ronnie refers to in a lot of the work that he's written, and a lot of the stories that prompted him to go to the Kennedy School in 1984, was really about how does he work at an aggregate level? How do you move a system? And so how do you bring multiple stakeholders together to work on that issue? Because you can't solve poverty, or you can't solve domestic violence by just focusing on the victims or focusing on the perpetrators. You've got to think about the whole system. And I think that's what mobilization is about, is thinking about, well, how do I mobilize everyone around this issue? And the people that need to be mobilized, who are those unusual voices that don't usually get a say on this issue, is really important, is to think about who are the unusual voices that we need to kind of get involved in the conversation.
Okay, so you've laid some nice framework here and some structure for us to go forward. I'm interested to shift it just for a moment to you yourself. So in this work, since you did the work at Harvard, 12 years ago, what have you learned about yourself as a conveyor of these ideas and how you teach and develop people? And maybe some of the mistakes or some of the errors you made along the way that have helped you develop a more refined delivery of the work. Because as you know, Nick, you're talking about helping people build capacity so they can function more. And that's a journey. That's a process. That's a practice. So help people understand your own journey, your own practice, and what you've learned along the way that helps them. Maybe will save them making the same mistakes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I have made many a mistake. And thanks, Rick, for the opportunity to share my dirty laundry. And I'm happy to. You're raising a really important issue. I think we need to talk more about our mistakes, because then we can learn from them. And so for me, I think when I came back from the Kennedy School, I was very excited. I had a big H attached to my forehead, really excited and enthusiastic about cascading these ideas. But I think what I learned pretty quickly is that people have their own ideas about how to move people and how to change organizations and how to transform organizations. And so what I learned pretty quickly is that it's about relationships. So you can't move anyone unless you've got a relationship. And I think that's where I found it really, I've had some not so good experiences where I've put pressure on some of those relationships when they weren't ready to have pressure put on them. And that's when it can create what we call the holding environment. The container isn't strong enough to hold this hot potato. And so I think that's where I've learned, I think, is that spending more time focusing on the relationships. And really, I think it is about building your authority. We talk about in the adaptive leadership framework about how do we deploy our authority, but I think it's also about how do we build informal relationships with people and understand what's important for them. And that can take the form of just being consistent. And like I can recall, like when I was working in one of the departments many years ago, and there was a healthy skepticism about the program that we were wanting to implement, and it was an adaptive leadership. The program was adaptive leadership. And they already had their set of ideas. And I can recall one of the directors that I was working with saying to me, we don't want to have to clean up a mess when you've gone. And so that for me was a real kind of warning to really think about really being careful about the work that we were doing and being smart and skillful and technically competent, but also being aware that there's a lot riding on this for other people. I think that's a real opportunity to step up too. And I think these are all indicators that are, if we were thinking about getting on the balcony, what is going on in the system for those kind of things to come up? And it's about trust, and it's about relationship, it's about contracting, about building the authority that building on the work that you've done to build those relationships, and then really engaging them as part of the program. or whatever you might be doing. And I think that's the real, for me, that's been the biggest learning, I think, is about staying in relationship and repairing trust when trust is on very tender ground. It's on tender hooks. And so I think the way that you can go about over time building those relationships, deploying yourself in the most competent way you can, but also working with other people, because I never do this work alone. I'm always doing it with other people. And so who has, thinking politically, who's got those relationships, who's got credibility, how can I leverage some of that to support the adaptive work, and how do I work and start where they are? And I think the thing is, people have their own interpretation of the world, their own set of frameworks, and how do you work with that? And I think you don't try to hit people over the head with the adaptive leadership framework is my kind of lesson. But I think is, as I become more of a wise owl in my 40s and have been kind of worn over time, is I think is that's the opportunity, is to really calculate what risk is worth taking here, and do I have enough credibility in the bank? Do I have enough authority in the bank to be able to pull this off, this experiment? And I have to say, in the past, I've been very on the more provocative end of using and deploying these set of ideas. And I think it's finding a balance. It's a polarity. Like, can I raise the heat? Can I ask a really tough question of the group? Can I deploy myself differently that may actually be discombobulating for the group? Like, I'm often thinking about, okay, what do I need to do first to build their level of trust with this group? And I think it's a range of techniques I've talked about, but I think there's some of the kind of things that have kind of either got me unstuck, and where I think people can, for me, has been to reflect on it now. And I haven't done a lot of reflection on it, to be honest. I mean, other than going, I shouldn't have done that. You put your head on your pillow at night going, you play things back. And I think that's important too, because your gut is an indication of, and your sleeplessness is an indication of, I guess, the adaptive work that you're facing into, about wanting to be liked, to want to be seen as doing good work. So there's a whole lot of stories kind of you're also trying to reconcile in your own mind. And I think, the most important thing is starting where people are, and listening and building those relationships. And when relationships become a little tricky, is thinking about how you can repair and rebuild and start again. And I think that's where there's plenty more.
That's okay. You've done well. You also remind me that Malcolm Knowles has some wise counsel for adult education. So he's taking a much broader scaffolding structural approach. And he's got a list of items that he thinks need to be tended to if you want to have a shot at being able to make progress. And one of them is people want to be regarded and have the felt experience that their prior experiences mattered and it counts, and it will be contributing to what they're trying to do going forward. And I think oftentimes people in our world come in like we're bringing a blank piece of paper here and everybody's starting fresh. And not enough good work is done in the advance of that to understand what's in the room in life and in general that we can work with, but also to have them have that experience of being felt and heard. And now they're really perhaps ready to go on the journey with us, at that point. So good counsel. Okay, so let's get into what I think is you sent me some information about some things you've been doing, and I read it and I thought you got some stuff here I want to talk to you about, because as I understand it, Nick, in reading your paper, you started with a place that we're all familiar with, which is done a lot of work in this area. And sometimes it just isn't working, and what's going on and what's the process and what are the demands that the organization has for how we develop leaders. And we've squandered a lot of resources of time, money, and energy trying to figure this code out and crack it. I read your paper to say you took that personally and you wanted to do something about that. And so you've done some work on this, and I want you to talk a little bit about what you call the leadership learning cycle, but maybe in your own words, what the seed corn was that you started to tap into that led you down this road. And then we can get into the model, but why you were provoked to do this and how it came about.
Yeah. Well, the first question, why I was provoked to do this, I think for many years I've been involved in developing and improving the capacity of people's leadership, and often involved in the development and design of leadership programs, whether it's coaching programs, team coaching programs, leadership programs. And I think the obvious thing to say is that people go to an event, often a workshop or an experience, and they say that it was a great experience. And I've been on the receiving end of that, looking at the evaluations, going, I've done a good job today, like pat on the back. But I think what happens is we don't see that sustained change or shift in behavior. And I think, it's an obvious thing to say, and there's a lot of research out there that says this, is that a one and done experience is not enough to move someone's leadership, to increase someone's leadership capacity. And I think that's where the frustration I was feeling is that, and I don't know if it was a symptom of COVID, but we were doing obviously a lot of virtual learning, and I'm sure you and others would have experienced this as well, is that it feels to me to a lot of the time I'm doing edutainment. I'm the expert providing, I've got to give an adaptive leadership workshop in 90 minutes. And by any means, I don't think you can achieve a lot in you can achieve some things in 90 minutes, maybe some level of awareness and understanding, but realistically, to get the adaptive leadership or any sort of model or set of ideas to help people learn that and to get it into their bones is going to take a long time. And I think that's what was the kind of impetus for this. But I actually have to acknowledge that at the time that I was kind of experiencing this frustration, that I enrolled in a master's program at the University of Technology Transdisciplinary School, the TD School, and they offer a master's in creative intelligence and strategic innovation. And they take a transdisciplinary approach. And that basically means is that we look at the practices, the methods, the values, the actions of other disciplines, and then we look at the problem through the lens of other disciplines and come up with something unique that's going to address that challenge. And so I guess for me, it was trying to use some of the models and ideas that I've learned through that master's program to really deconstruct leadership education, because I think we've got into a situation where we've industrialized leadership education to such an extent that yes, it provides an opportunity to scale things, to scale leadership education, but at the same time, I think if there's something it's created a problem in the system. And what I mean by that, we're generating a lot of content and curating a lot of content, creating a lot of content, but how is that actually translating into habit change, behavioral change? And as an organization who is investing in leadership development, whether through procuring external providers or whether they're developing through internal resources, deploying and scaling and leadership development, I think we owe it as good stewards to really robustly reflect on think critically about, okay, let's not just go through the motions. Let's actually step back and look at how we are doing things. And is this actually working? And for me, what I felt was, it was a sheep dip kind of experience where we were putting people through programs and experiences, but we actually weren't seeing the shift or the accountability of leaders and so we know that leadership is not enough, in the sense leadership education is not enough. But I think for me, it's kind of how do we really dissect, deconstruct the way we design and educate leaders. And so that's where really I was starting from.
Okay. So you've got very specific though now. You have a model. I'm compelled by it, the leadership learning cycle. So I'm just going to tee you up a little bit because I really, this is your conversation. You have 4 parts to this, and I'm interested in you being able to explain the parts, but also the wholeness of it, the integration of it. But let's take it in turn. So talk about how you came to these elements, what they are, and why these 4 versus 5 or 3 others or something. So how did you get here?
Well, I drew heavily on Case Dorst. He was the program director at the TD school that I mentioned at UTS, and he developed this, I guess, this language, Temple, Podium, Lab, and Academy, to develop an innovation ecosystem. So I've repurposed that set of ideas for creating, I guess, a leadership learning cycle. It's pretty noticeable, and I don't know if you've noticed this, but if you think of Kolb's the learning cycle around, it really reflects the different ways that people learn. And there's a lot of research out there that says that's debunked learning styles, and the neuroscience now says people learn very differently than the way that we were taught as adult educators to teach and to help people learn. And so thank Christ things have evolved. But I think what is really interesting about it, I think, is, if I was to take each part of the model and kind of walk you through it, I think it's just it's to provide a more tangible, more accessible language to think about your own leadership development. And so you can think of it as a way of designing and sequencing a leadership program, or you could think of about it or apply it in terms of your own daily kind of everyday moments of leadership.
I was going to say, let's take them one at a time then, so people can track with it. So I don't know the way your paper presents it. There's an order. I don't know if it starts with academy or if it matters. Okay, so why don't you start with academy?
Sure, sure. So in talking about, I guess, academy, which is the kind of the first and often the more traditional way we think about leadership education. And I think this really is, in a very traditional way, a formal, low heat, formal learning environment where learning content and practices are explored and taught. So there's nothing extraordinary about that. But I think it's kind of the function of it is really kind of separating out and kind of narrowing in on structured kind of learning. And it's really just to give you an example, it might be a workshop on a particular model, might be adaptive leadership, it might be authentic leadership, whatever it might be. It's about introducing new ideas, new concepts, and applying those to case studies. So in many ways, it's kind of instruction-led learning. So it's more hearing from an expert, and really it's a low heat experience, and it's more on the more didactic, more formal kind of learning. And so that's the kind of the academy. There's nothing necessarily special about it, but it's kind of just calling it out.
But it is an essential part in development. So we want to keep that part. Yeah. Okay.
Correct. It's pretty essential. It's served us well. It's, as we know, it's a very common way that a vehicle by which people do leadership development, a very traditional kind of way we do leadership education. Moving on to the lab, which is probably more contemporary kind of thing we've been seeing a lot lately. I don't know about you, but I hear a lot of people talking about a leadership lab or a laboratory, and obviously the adaptive leadership framework, but also the teaching methodology, case in point, kind of creates this kind of laboratory environment where the classroom is about looking at leadership in real time. So thinking about where examples of leadership happen in the room itself and how can we use those as case studies, examples of where we can learn from and practice leadership. And so, and case in point is, would be an example of where the lab could be an experience that could be created. And I would say, depending on, your situation, your context, this could be a low heat to medium heat experience. To be able to, you could do small groups, it could be peer learning, but it's a laboratory, it's a place for experimentation. In many ways, it's a contemporary thing that you might see a lot of organizations talking about these days. So the podium's probably for me, is probably the most kind of edgiest thing that is in this kind of this concept that around Podium, Temple, Lab, Academy. And it's where leaders are actually in the limelight in their day-to-day situation. It's a real stakes environment. And so this element is to help, I guess, people embed what they've learned in the temple or the academy. And it's actually giving a name to I don't know about you, but when you think you're on a podium, the heat is on, the pressure is on. And I think we need to orchestrate environments, learning environments, where people get to experience that. Aside from, there's a lot of people feel there can be a lot of risk associated with the podium, but this is kind of creating infrastructure in a learning program or in your daily kind of leadership moments where you're purposely and intentionally creating moments on the podium. And that's really the idea that where you either present or you're having a difficult conversation, it's giving opportunity to. It's like being on the stage, an actor in a theatre environment. So it's kind of that where the audience is looking to you, but also it's how do you, from an adaptive perspective, is how do we think about asking questions to help the group take maybe some responsibility for an issue. So it's really experimenting with how do I be the person trying to help people take on this adaptive challenge. So what do I need to be saying? What stories might I need to be telling? How do I get better at holding attention? And so this might be where you would, for that particular kind of capacity you're trying to build, the ability to get below the neck, as Ronnie would say, versus above the neck, which is kind of where the lab and academy sit. It's kind of you're working in people's head, in their logic systems, where if you're trying to get people to engage differently below the neck, which is kind of in people's hearts, minds, and guts, the podium, we need to practice being able to do that. And I don't think, at least from my experience when I was developing this model with some colleagues, is that we didn't have experiences in our leadership suite that did this. And so that's really where we saw the opportunity.
I agree with you. When I was reading your description of this, I thought I just had this whole history of people watching people stand in front of a room, attempting to deliver something important, and really believing that when the moment comes, the words will come and they will make sense and they will flow. And it's cringeworthy oftentimes. I'm reminded of that great story of Winston Churchill going to Parliament to do the House of Commons debate. And he pulls up, the car pulls up, and the chauffeur opens the door, and he doesn't get out, he doesn't get out, he doesn't get out. And finally, he says, "Prime Minister, we're here." And he says, "Don't interrupt me. I'm preparing my impromptu remarks." And I thought, that's what he's doing there. He knows that when he gets in front of that place, he's got to be on it. And I love your advocacy and your provocation here that this is not a winging function, that this is something you got to show up and be prepared for, because everything communicates. And if it's a crummy communication, your followers pick up, they don't have to care about this. So I think you're on to something here in this model and the location of it. So first time I've seen that in explicit terms, and I appreciate you putting that work in. All right, let's go to the last step, temple.
Temple, yeah. So what this is really about, and again, it's something that's kind of missing from the leadership experiences that we were creating, is that there's not a space for leaders to, and a temple, when you think of the metaphoric space of a temple, it's a very solemn place. It's a ritualistic space. It's a very reflective space where people can connect with their purpose, their interior selves, and I guess what matters to them. And I think that's really important, that people, and particularly having a set of an environment which in a sense is a temple, we can create these environments in our everyday, but also in the work that I do is in leadership programs. And I think it's tried to give, we talk about crucible moments where that have kind of required us to step up in some shape or form, and that have been really pivotal moments in our own kind of journey. And this is an opportunity, I guess, to reflect on those, and it gives people to get a sense of what's their growth edge, what is the next, what is the edge of my frontier of competence, and thinking deeply about, and it is again below the neck, thinking about my dad would say, grow a second heart muscle, son. And that is the kind of idea is how do we grow this additional capacity to be able to understand our interior, but also it's to actually connect with what our higher purpose is. And often, I guess, when we're so on the dance floor all the time, we are in the action, we are literally in the action all the time. I think it provides a space that is really allowing us to be able to notice our own patterns and recognize those patterns. So, when we think about observe, interpret, and intervene, it's really playing in that observation space when we think about the adaptive model, set of practices and ideas. It's trying to get people to get on the balcony, but also think about, and I know I've alluded to this in the paper, is around adult orders of mind. So how do we shift and evolve our consciousness? So it's really, in many ways, to think about, well, as Keegan would say, operating from the socialized mind, which is really, authority is external to me. And, we look to authority for answers. But when it's an adaptive challenge, I think at a minimum, we need people to be self-authored, in the sense that people are being able to exercise from their own inner seat of judgment and make choices and exercise leadership. So this is what And I wanted to also give an example. I guess there are places, and whether it's you might be think this might bring up your own kind of ideas of a temple. It's kind of in a very secular society, we don't have these necessarily. People don't have these spaces, and so when I think about in the context of a leadership program, the Australian Institute of Police Management has a great space in Manly where a lot of police people in Australia go and across the world go to learn about leadership, but it's also very much it's got a very reflective, safe space for people to step off the dance floor and to really reflect. And it's a very natural environment around it. It's in some ways a little bit isolated. And so I think the power of it provides a space for reflection that we don't, it's such a luxury because we have so much information coming at us all the time. And so that's what I think it creates a space for us to think, to get on the balcony, to check our interior kind of state, to think about what's my work in terms of when I'm connecting with my purpose am I focused on the work and the issue, or am I focused on my less noble sides of myself? And so it gets you an opportunity to kind of, in combining all of that infrastructure, I think is the most powerful thing that I've been talking about. But I think the temple is a very powerful kind of putting a line in the sand and kind of calling it out. I think it's a really powerful kind of making it explicit. I think that's what I was trying to do in the model.
It's interesting. I think you're right. It's an essential component of development, growth. I think it's interesting to see the different worlds. If you're looking at, say, for example, professional sports teams, or if you go to the symphony or you go to the ballet, we see the performance, we see the dance floor. What we don't see is that all those players and actors and performers, the next day, they're watching video and tape and about what they did well and what they didn't do well and how do they improve, and then they go back out and practice. And so they have a developmental thing built into their profession that leads to such high performance, and it's oftentimes lacking in a business context. So the inclusion of the temple in your model, I think, is an essential reminder that high performance is directly linked to my willingness to reflect on how I'm doing and get feedback from other people, whatever that may be like. So it's a wise model. I think we'll let people know we'll put links in the podcast episode. So if you want to include some of this information there, they can find it and follow up with you. All right. So I'm going to shift gears on you a little bit here. And I know you know a little bit about Peter Block. Peter Block is a contrarian in every sense of the word, and I'm a huge fan. He's got a thing about leading. He views leaders as social architects. And he says there's three functions social architects have: is to create context, why we're gathering, initiate and convene the space so the conversation can take place, and then listen and pay attention. And his argument is we've overcomplexed the development of leadership, and it doesn't need to be that way. And we need more community social architects in our societies because the work is so broad and so deep. So I'm just curious, for you and I who spend our time delving in these deep thoughts and stuff, here comes Block, and he's reduced it down to three specific focuses with a lot of depth of work that's associated with each of those. It's not easy stuff. So what do you think? Are we overthinking this thing sometimes? Can we get it simpler so that people can get grip on it and they can get some work done?
Yeah, it's a big question. Depending on which camp you sit in, I think it can be particularly people that are very passionate about the situation as it is. For me, I think, at least from what I hear from a lot of people, is, so what is this? Can you make it simpler? I feel like we are, to some extent, boiling the ocean. And I think it's with all good intention, though. I think we're trying to get it right. And I think in the process of getting it right, we are in that experimentation, making it a little bit convoluted, unnecessary. And so I think you're right. But I think on the other end of the scale, then the trap is that we make it so simple and that it doesn't create a gap for people to step into to learn. And so I think it's a really tricky thing. I think, yes, we need to make it really clear and have models and frameworks and tools. And I think, like, I don't know about you, but for the last few years, I've just been creating tools and building tools for leaders to be able to be more effective. But what I think the challenge is they struggle to pick that tool up when they need it and then to deploy it effectively. And I think that's the biggest, I think, struggle, is that we've created a lot of tools, but what happens is that leaders struggle to know what to do or how to deploy it. And I think, and obviously Erwin talks to this is about, in terms of education, there's not enough training. Erwin Turbot talks a lot about leadership, executive education, doing a lot of, it provides an enormous amount of support to helping people, building people's capacity, but actually doesn't give people the training that, in the sense that they need, is, and even at the most senior levels. I'm working across, a large organization where we need people every day to exercise leadership in their role. We need everyone to see themselves as a leader. I think we get trapped in this scaling issue about how do we do that in a way that's simple enough, but then also enough to give people a sense that this is grounded in something. This is just not coming out of thin air.
All right, so you lead me to the next question that I had. So not everybody can go to Harvard. I studied this stuff at business school at Oxford. There's some challenges with that model for a lot of people in terms of their ability. So let's give people some specific things that they could work on and actually maybe build the practice, because at Harvard they call it the art and practice. So what would you say are some essential starting points for people if they want to start to build some capacity, not only in the specific, but in the structure? And I think your learning model helps with some structure here. But where should they begin if they want to start to have better grip on using themselves to lead? What do you think's top of mind for you?
Well, I think they've got to not start with them. And I think Ronnie gets this right, Ron Heifetz, in terms of his outside in versus inside out. And what I mean by that is that we've got to start with the issue we're trying to work on. And I think that's when we understand what the issue is, which is a diagnostic issue, I think building your ability to observe is essential for anything tangible. Noticing, observing, and being able to separate that from interpretation. And I think that is probably, if you can do anything else, if you don't do anything else, sorry, is practice observing. And you don't need to necessarily say anything, but you could be in a meeting and you could just lean your chair back a little bit and just observe who's doing a lot of the talking, or who's talking after who. What are some of the dynamics? Who gets shut down? Whose idea gets currency? I think these are the things, these ability to observe is an essential activity of leadership. And that's something you can be doing every day, all the time. And you're building that skill of observation. And that's key to leadership, I think.
Okay, so we're coming to our close here. So what's ahead for you? What's top of mind? What are you trying to get done here now that you've done this great work? You've created this model. What's up for you?
Well, so a couple of things. I'm looking at the moment, I'm currently enrolled, well, I'm about to enroll in a PhD. And so a glutton for punishment, really, just completed 3 years of study and about to start a PhD. And that PhD is going to be looking at case in point and looking at comparing formal kind of leadership learning methods and practices with case in point, and what is more successful in helping build people's leadership capacity. And for those out there that don't know what case in point is the leadership methodology or learning methodology that Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky and others have built and developed and evolved over the years. And it's about using the group as a case, an example, to illustrate an idea about leadership. And it's very experiential, it's more emergent kind of learning. So it's trying to replicate the real world, creating in a classroom the real life experience with the real stakes. And so I want to understand, and building on the work of Sharon Parks, who wrote a book called Leadership Can Be Taught, who spent a lot of time in Ron's classrooms over many years trying to dissect, how the efficacy of the model, what was going on in these rooms. And I think people are still we don't have enough evidence, an evidence base. And so I think that's the real opportunity that's where I'm turning my attention to, is looking at how do we compare case in point as a way of teaching and using cases, and how does that compare to more formal learning? And I'm not saying that case in point isn't formal learning, because I think there are elements of case in point that are more, structured activities, more formal, sitting on the more didactic end. So that's for me is just trying to understand, actually, can we compare and contrast these things and really come to an answer about, well, what actually is more effective, what works, and how might that inform other leadership educators about how they might use, apply, deploy this pedagogical method, which, for me has been a profound way to learn about how I deploy myself as a leader and how do I move and mobilize people. So that's where I'm turning my attention to, other than like getting my hands dirty with a lot of in different forums and different groups, working with leaders every day to help increase their leadership. And yeah, so that's my main, where I turn my attention to next.
Well, Nick Ellem, I want to thank you on behalf of practitioners and other people who are delving and spending time in a leadership development space, because your continued contribution of research-based and well thought out ideas and points of view have been essential to a lot of people. And to know you're decided to take the deep end of the pool academically and become a doctor of case in point is going to be pretty dang cool for the rest of us. And so just get on with it, would you? Because we need the work. So thank you very much for coming to the swamp, and much appreciated.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to 10,000 Swamp Leaders with Rick Torset. Please take this moment and hit subscribe to follow more Leadership Swamp conversations.